Today, we're going to be taking a look at the Create Molten Metals mod and the Create Metalwork mod, which add molten metals to the Create mod. Now, this is a feature that I've wanted in the mod for a long time, just because of the different possibilities of automation with molten metals, but also just being able to put your metals in tanks to either store or move around your world. So I'm really excited to explore these two mods together and see what benefits they might add to the Create experience. And as I did mention, there are two separate mods that do very similar things. So up at the top right, you will see a little emblem that'll let you know if I'm talking about the Create Metalwork mod or if I'm talking about the Create Molten Metals mod. So just take a look at that so that we'll know which mod we're talking about. So starting off with Create Molten Metals, there are a bunch of different metals you can get. You can get all four of the kind of base metals in the game. Plus, you can also get zinc from the Create mod and brass from the Create mod, which has a really cool little recipe for it, which we'll get into in just a bit. Now, to actually get the liquid form of metals, we have a little setup over here to make that happen. So all you need to do is either take the raw variant of the block, the ore variant of the block, or you can also take plates, which is really cool because by default, once you've pressed them, you can't convert them back. But now we can convert it back into regular gold and then form that back into ingots, which is really useful. And once you have those, you can then feed them into a basin with a mixer above it. So I'll feed one in of each so you can see it work. And then we need to go ahead and heat it. So we're going to power up the blaze burner, which will heat it. You'll see it mixing up, and then you'll see our tank fill up with gold. So you get 110 millibuckets of gold per, and a whole bucket is 1,000 millibuckets. So essentially for every 10 ingots you're smelting down, you get one block, which you can then place in your world or store in your tank. Now, to actually turn your gold into your ingot form, there is an additional step. So looking here in this chest, I have two different molds. The first is kind of your early game mold, which is a ceramic mold. You craft this with 5 clay balls to get the unfired ceramic mold, and then you just either cook that up in a furnace to turn it into a ceramic ingot mold, or you can use bulk blasting to very easily get this, and it can even be automated through blasting to get your ceramic ingot mold. And then your kind of late game option is going to be the iron or regular ingot mold, which is 2 ingots and 3 sheets, which is relatively cheap. Now, to actually use these, we need to fill with a spout with our gold. So you can see our molten metal is fed down into our mold, and then our mold is now filled up with the metal. And these little blocks are so cool. I think they'd be really nice little decorations, as well as like the useful block. And so yeah, I'm a really big fan of these little blocks. Now, the last step to get our ingot out is we need to wash it. So I've got a little washer set up here so I can put it on this depot. You can see it's washed up. And our ingot mold, or our regular iron one, is going to be retrieved. So you can see we now have our gold ingot and our ingot mold. However, the starter ingot mold, or our like fired one, does get lost. So you can see after this is washed, we just have our gold ingot. So really you do want to kind of try to grind out for iron ingot molds so that we can just kind of refresh them in your automation system, where the ceramic molds should really just be used early game. And one other cool thing you can do with the molten metals is you can actually use them to alloy stuff. So to get molten netherite, if you mix 4 ingots of gold and 4 netherite scrap, you will get molten netherite, so you could automate that process. And you can also automate your brass. So by mixing up molten copper and molten zinc, one of each, you get 1 brass, which is pretty cool. However, it's extra effort and you still only get 1, so I don't really know if it's super worth it to go through this effort for either brass or the netherite. Now, 1 raw gold gets you 1 iron, which isn't, it doesn't seem worth it on the surface. I'm surprised that we don't get a better output for putting this through. However, that is the way the mod is set up, but that's not all we get. We also get this slag. So whenever we mix up any of our different stuff, we do get slag as a byproduct. Now, that slag isn't useless. We can take that slag and we can crush it down in crushing wheels, and we get some extra stuff. So you can see it'll crush down, and from this first bit, we're going to get some cobblestone and some flint. Not super useful, but if you do look at what you can get, it says you have a less than 1% chance at getting all the different nuggets. Now, I did run 10 stacks of items through, so about 640 slag, and we got about 6 of each. So it looks like it's kind of right at 1%, maybe a little bit under, but you can essentially assume for every 10 stacks you're only going to get 6 nuggets, so you'd really need 9 stacks of slag to get a full ingot, so it really isn't worth it. And honestly, I think that's the biggest miss in this mod. It's a 1-to-1 conversion, so unless you disable regular ingot making, there's really no reason to build this system, because our slag outputs are pretty worthless unless you want to use them as decoration blocks, and these things do look pretty good as decoration blocks. Some of the textures do seem to flow a bit fast. I don't know if that's an error, if that's intentional, but I mean, they do look kind of nice, and it is cool to still be able to have your liquid metals. Now, I would definitely recommend that the mod author take a look at boosting the rates of either what you get from the slag so it's worth processing down, or potentially look at doubling your ore output through for putting it through the system, because as it stands right now, it really doesn't feel like worth having the blaze burner set up and then the automation to spout it and then wash it afterwards. But that being said, it does give us molten metal, which is very, very cool. So now we're going to talk about Create Metalwork, which also gives us all of our base materials. We got the iron, the copper, the gold, and the netherite. And we also have brass and zinc with this one, but we also have a molten andesite and a molten andesite alloy block, so we can automatically process down our andesite alloy, which is really cool. And taking a look at how this stuff is crafted up, it's very similar. However, you need to have the crushed variant. So you take the crushed ore, which is kind of nice because to make the crushed ore, you also get the nuggets of experience, so you're not losing that by crushing it, but you feed that into your mixer, then you heat it up, and then I'm going to start getting out my molten gold. And now to process this down in ingots, it's a lot simpler. All we need to do is feed it into a basin and then have it pressed. So that is quite a bit easier than having to go through our ingot mold process. And for alloying, it works just about the same way, where all I need to do is mix up my crushed raw zinc and crushed raw copper, and that'll automatically get us brass, or we can also mix up the molten versions, and we are able to turn our ingots into the molten versions, so we do have that as an availability. However, we can't turn plates into these, so once you press plates in this mod, they are used up. And again, our brass is a 1-to-1 conversion, so unless you already have the molten metal, there really isn't a reason to go about creating the molten metal to make brass. And we can also do andesite alloy automatically by mixing zinc and andesite. And this, again, is a 1-to-1 ratio, so it's going to give you the same output as regular mixing. So unless you really want to mess with the molten metals, it's probably not worth it. But again, molten metal is cool, so it might be worth it to you and your build. Now, one thing you might notice is we put a half stack of crushed raw gold in and we got a whole stack out. And that's because this actually doubles your output. So if you put 1 gold in, you see it'll melt down, be pulled out, and then pressed, and then we get 2 ingots out the back end. So this is super worth going through the process of, because you essentially are going to be doubling your output. Now, because everything molten in here does come from the crushed stuff, that means we also have crushed netherite scrap and crushed andesite, which are new blocks. And to get those, you just feed them through crushing wheels. Pretty straightforward. And actually, you know what? This is worth doing. The brass still isn't. You should just craft that like normal. However, the andesite, you don't just get a stack when you crush it, you get 1.75 stacks. So that essentially gives you an extra 48 for every stack of andesite alloy you craft up. Now for netherite scrap, you also get 1.5 crushed netherite scrap, but you still only use 4. So that's very worth doing because your netherite, you're essentially going to get 1.5 netherite ingots for every 4 scrap. So it is totally worth doing for the netherite, and still probably worth doing with the andesite too, especially because you're going to get those sweet nuggets of experience as a byproduct. And then, of course, with our doubling and extra resources with netherite and andesite, we also do get to put these in tanks. And honestly, I kind of like the textures of the Create Metalwork a little bit better than the Create Molten Metals textures. And that includes in the basins, they kind of have that like wavy texture like the chocolate from Create does. So if I take a bucket of chocolate, it kind of has like that cool wavy, drippy texture. They kind of pull that into the metals too. They don't really look molten. Like this doesn't read as molten iron to me. However, like the copper, the brass, and even the netherite do look pretty good. I just kind of wish they would maybe like redden this up and make it look hot. Right now, it just kind of looks like mudslide. However, as the decoration blocks, if you need a mudslide, there you go. And then, of course, looking back at our molten metals, you can see that they're just a little messier, and our metalwork ones are maybe just a bit cleaner and more refined. Now, that being said, I think these are both really cool mods and would definitely be fun to add in your world just to have the molten metals. And especially if you're building a mod pack and want to lock metals behind a bit more effort, I think this is a cool way to do it. So I hope you guys enjoyed that quick look into the Create Metalwork and Create Molten Metals mods. They will be linked down in the description below, so definitely go check them out. And with that, make sure to like and subscribe if you want to see more content like this, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye.